They had it planned since the start of senior year. 7 friends, Lucas, Ian, Sarah, Becky, Aaron, Miles, and Jess, tight-knit since freshman orientation, had made a pact. One last trip together before real life scattered them. No phones, no dorms, just the Sierra National Forest, a few coolers, a tent each, and the same alpine lake Lucas had visited with his father as a kid. The site they chose was 15 miles off pavement, marked only by faded trail markers and ranger maps. They called it the last campout. Everyone cleared their schedules, pooled gear, borrowed a second SUV, and circled a weekend in August 2003. Photos from the night before show them packed tight in someone's apartment, stuffing trail mix into plastic bags, teasing each other about bears, passing around a Sharpie to write their names on canteens. They left from San Jose around noon on a Friday and stopped at a hardware store in Groveland for gas, rope, extra lighters, and firewood. Security footage would later show all 7 standing outside the gas station convenience store, eating ice cream bars in the sun. That was the last confirmed sighting. The ranger station logbook at Pine Meadow lists 2 vehicle plates signed in at 4:47 p.m. Under Backcountry Area 9C, Deer Hollow Route. The ranger on duty that day, a now retired woman named Florence Maynard, later said they seemed excited, respectful, even over-prepared. They had emergency flares, laminated maps, and multiple first aid kits. One of the girls, she thought it might have been Sarah, even asked about where to hang their food bags to avoid animals. They signed in, took a trail pamphlet, and drove in. Nothing seemed off, but 3 days later, when Monday came and went and no one had returned or signed out, nothing was flagged. It was summer. Late returns were common. Besides, there were no cell phone pings. Coverage in the basin was non-existent. On Tuesday morning, Sarah's mother called her roommate after not hearing back. Jess's employer filed a no-show report with campus administration. But it was Lucas's father, retired military, who drove straight to the ranger station after the second day of silence. He insisted something was wrong. The ranger on shift didn't disagree, but protocol required 48 hours, past expected return time for a formal report. It was now Wednesday. That night, 2 rangers and a county deputy drove up toward the last known location. They found the vehicles parked near the Deer Hollow turnout. Both locked. One of the SUVs had a handwritten note under the windshield wiper. Hike toward Ridgewater, back Sunday. That would have been 2 days before. By dawn Thursday, the official search had started. Dogs, drones, helicopters, 30 volunteers. Weather was clear, temperatures mild. There were no signs of rock slides, animal activity, or foul weather. The group's intended site was eventually located by a ranger using a topographic overlay. What they found was eerie. Tents still staked, sleeping bags rolled, coolers half full, untouched bags of trail mix near a fire ring. It looked less like a group who had packed up and more like one who had stepped away momentarily and never returned. Footprints were scattered, leading in multiple directions, some downhill, some deeper into the tree line. No blood, no broken gear. But the longer the investigators stayed, the more it began to feel wrong. Phones were zipped inside tent bags, wallets and IDs in a shared plastic tub. A GPS unit with fresh batteries sat in one of the camp chairs. It had not been turned on. Within 48 hours of that first discovery, media picked up the story. 7 college grads gone without a trace. Headlines called it a backcountry vanishing. Theories poured in: animal attack and cult encounter, accidental drowning, even whispers of remote criminal groups. But the lake near their site was shallow. No one drowned, no animals left tracks, and no signs of violence were found anywhere. Helicopters ran grid searches 3 times daily for 10 days. Every ranger was pulled from other posts. The FBI joined in by the 3rd week. Nothing. It was as if the group had walked into the woods and dissolved. In later interviews, friends described the group as stable, close, with no drama, no history of mental health crises, no substance issues, no recent arguments or romantic entanglements. The only tension anyone could recall was between Ian and Lucas over something that had happened sophomore year, but no one could recall what it was. At the time, no one thought it mattered. They were best friends. That's what everyone said. Nothing about this made sense. The search officially ended 31 days after it began. Bodies were never recovered. No personal items ever surfaced. The parents held a joint vigil back at the university campus in early October. 7 candles, 7 names, 7 families asking the same question: how can that many people just disappear? And even now, 2 decades later, that's how the story always starts. With 7 people driving into the woods for a weekend of memories, and no one coming back. By Thursday afternoon, less than a day after the parents reported the group missing, a joint search and rescue team was assembled at the ranger station. The vehicles were still parked exactly where they'd been left, locked, dust-covered. A ranger cracked one window to confirm inside. Nothing unusual. Maps, wrappers, a water bottle under the seat. All signs pointed to an ordinary hike that had never ended. The search team began their sweep just past Deer Hollow, tracing the faded trail system toward a high-altitude site marked Ridgewater Spur. By late evening, they found the camp. It was tucked between 2 dense tree lines, about 3 miles off the lake's eastern edge. The clearing held 4 tents, all still zipped shut. Inside were sleeping bags, folded clothing, even books. Nothing looked disturbed. One of the coolers still held uneaten sandwiches. Another had melted ice soaking through packs of eggs and sliced fruit. Firewood was stacked beside the pit. A log stool was half burned at the edge of the fire ring, but the flames had long since died out. On a nearby rock, someone had laid out a first aid kit and 2 flashlights, one with a cracked lens, the other drained of batteries. It didn't look like a place left in a rush. It looked like people intended to return. Then they found the phones. 6 in total, stored together inside a waterproof gear tub, all powered off. The 7th phone, they later confirmed, was left charging at Jess's apartment. A few feet away, 2 loaded backpacks leaned against a tree. One was unzipped, trail maps poking out from the top flap. Another lay face down in the grass, its outer strap torn. There were no visible bloodstains, no weapons, no drag marks, no wildlife prints. Just partial human footprints spaced unevenly, leading in multiple directions, some looping back to the fire pit, others veering toward the forest's steeper incline. At the edge of a small ravine, a deputy paused. Something pale had caught the sunlight. Lodged in a tangle of grass and damp leaves was a single boot. It was a women's hiking boot, caked in mud, laces missing. Inside was a crushed sock, size 6. No blood, no foot. Investigators later confirmed it belonged to Sarah. It was the only item found outside the camp perimeter for the next 10 days. The forensic unit brought in canine teams on day 2. The dogs picked up a scent that trailed northeast for almost half a mile before disappearing near a shallow stream. Rangers speculated that if the group had fled for any reason, water could have broken the scent chain. But there were no signs of flooding, no recent storms. No missing person in the group had a known medical or psychological history that might suggest delusion or disorientation. They were healthy, young, experienced enough with camping to follow basic safety protocols. Even the food bags had been properly hung to avoid bears. Whoever left that camp knew what they were doing, until they didn't. Drones scanned every elevation between the lake basin and the upper ridge for weeks. Over 200 volunteers logged 4,000 combined hours hiking quadrant lines. A Black Hawk helicopter was deployed for 3 days. Emergency radio frequencies were monitored 24/7. Nothing, not a jacket, not a torn page, not a scrap of tent material. It was like they had stepped out of sight and been erased. Theories emerged quickly. Animal attack was ruled out. A group that size wouldn't vanish without a struggle. Bears and cougars don't take 7 people in a silent ambush. Lightning strike? There was no storm. River accident? No nearby rapids. One deputy considered whether they could have accidentally eaten something toxic, mushrooms, berries, but the food found at camp was all pre-packaged, supermarket bought. Every detail contradicted the next. By week 4, the energy began to wane. Crews rotated out. Volunteers stopped showing up. The parents lingered near the trailhead. Some camped in their own tents, refusing to leave. A photo of the group, all 7 smiling in front of a campus mural, was taped to a pine tree near the main checkpoint. Below it, someone wrote in marker, "Come home, just come home." The official search was scaled back after 31 days. Unofficial efforts continued for years, but that first sweep, the one that found everything and nothing, stayed frozen in investigators' minds. Because the camp didn't look like a crime scene. It didn't look like a farewell. It looked like they left to watch the stars or follow a noise or check something out, and just never came back. As if the woods had swallowed them, quietly, all at once. It wasn't until the second week of the investigation that someone reviewed the physical sign-in logbook again. The entries at Pine Meadow Ranger Station were often overlooked, mostly used for fire season tracking and trail usage stats. Most hikers didn't even bother signing in or out, but in this case, they mattered. The 7 friends had signed in on August 15th, 2 vehicles, 2 lines, clear handwriting, destination listed as Ridgewater Spur 9C. But 3 pages later, in a slightly different shade of blue ink, there was another entry. It was dated August 18th, 3 days after the group's arrival. It simply read, Tanner M. Solo, camping near Deer Hollow. No return date, no plate number, no additional notes. The name didn't match any of the missing. None of their friends or family recognized it. Investigators initially assumed it was unrelated. Hikers came through that area every few days, but the date was tight. Too tight. The camp had already been abandoned by then. If this man had truly been in the area, he might have seen something. Maybe he passed the group. Maybe he heard something. Maybe he found the camp himself and didn't report it. But the signature itself raised red flags. Rangers said it didn't match any familiar locals, and when investigators cross-checked it with permit records, vehicle registrations, state ID databases, and even wilderness survival forms, no Tanner M. was found. No one by that name applied for a fire permit, held a hunting license, or had been ticketed for any hiking violations in the state. They ran it through facial recognition systems in case it was a nickname. Nothing. The FBI checked census data. Still nothing. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, slightly erratic slant, short loops, rushed pen pressure, possibly male, possibly not. The signature alone gave them no real anchor. But it was all they had. A name, a date, a claimed location, nothing else. A retired ranger named Ed Lemons reached out to the task force after hearing about the signature on the news. He hadn't worked that station in years, but he remembered something odd. On August 18th, late afternoon, he was visiting the nearby Hollow Creek access gate when he saw a man walking alone near the North Trail. According to Ed, the man was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, sunglasses, and carried what looked like a military-style day pack. Ed waved. The man didn't wave back, just kept walking. At the time, it wasn't suspicious. People passed through all the time. But what stood out, Ed said, was that the man didn't look tired or dusty, and he was walking toward the basin, into the woods, late in the day, when most hikers were heading out. Ed thought about checking the nearby trail camera later that evening to see if it caught the man's face, but the feed had gone down during a thunderstorm 2 days earlier. The lightning had fried the solar array, and the SD card was corrupted. By the time the backup system came online, the window had passed. The camera had been dead during the exact span when the group vanished, and when this mysterious Tanner M. signed in. The task force tried to put out a public notice, asking for any hikers named Tanner or anyone who might have used that name while traveling. A few leads trickled in, one man in Arizona, another in Oregon, but none had been in California in 2003. Several online sleuths speculated it was a false name, possibly even a warning left by someone involved. Others suggested the person had signed in after stumbling across the abandoned camp but chose not to report it out of fear. None of the theories could be confirmed, and with no photo, no license plate, and no living witness to match the name to a face, the lead went cold. Years later, when the logbook was digitized, that one line remained as stark and haunting as it had the day it was written. Not a flourish, not a hint of personality, just Tanner M. in firm, uneven strokes. A name that didn't belong, a date that didn't make sense, and a location, Deer Hollow, that placed him just hours from where 7 young people had last been seen alive. Whether he saw something or did something, no one ever knew, because the man behind the ink was never found. And after that, No one else ever signed into the station again using that name. For nearly 2 years, the case remained a wall of silence. Search logs were closed. The footage from the trail camera never recovered. Tanner M. had become more theory than person. Then, in early 2005, a campus podcast revisiting the case aired an episode titled The Last Seven. It included interviews with old classmates, professors, and a few family members. That's when someone came forward, a woman named Melanie, who had been Alicia's roommate during that final semester. Alicia hadn't been one of the 7, but she had almost gone. According to Melanie, Alicia was originally part of the plan. Her name had been on the packing list, and she'd helped shop for gear just 10 days before the trip. But something changed. 3 days before they left, she dropped out without giving a full reason. Melanie said Alicia came home from class looking tense. She packed up her gear and gave it back to Jess, muttering only that she didn't want to deal with it. Melanie never pressed, but in the weeks after the group vanished, Alicia reportedly had trouble sleeping. She avoided campus vigils and didn't attend the memorial. When authorities reached out, Alicia finally agreed to speak, quietly, off record, and with conditions. She said there had been a fight, not with her, but between 2 of the group, Ian and Lucas. It had happened the night before the trip. She didn't hear every word, but she remembered the argument being sharp, personal. She described it as the kind of fight that sounded like it had been brewing for years. She remembered the phrase, "You said you'd burn it," and then something about the letter. She never saw the letter herself, but she believed it existed. And she believed that whatever it contained, it wasn't something meant to follow them into the woods. Investigators revisited personal belongings retrieved from the group's dorms. They combed laptops, notebooks, even scanned dorm printers going back months. Nothing matching the description of a letter turned up. No drafts, no saved documents, no paper fragments. Still, Alicia was clear. She said the tension in the group had started months before. Something freshman year. Something only a few of them had been involved in. She couldn't say what exactly, but her voice changed when she talked about Lucas. Said he was the kind of person who didn't let things go. Said Ian had seemed more nervous than angry, like someone afraid of what might resurface. It wasn't much, just a second-hand recollection. But it planted doubt. If the group had fractured before even leaving, then their disappearance might not have been the result of a single, sudden incident. It could have been a slow unraveling, one triggered by buried resentment or guilt or the fear of something being revealed. Still, Alicia never suggested violence. She insisted these were people she trusted, people she loved, but she also admitted something else, something that stuck with detectives more than anything else she said. She told them she had a gut feeling, that if she had gone, she wouldn't have come back either. Not because someone would have hurt her, but because something about that trip felt final. As if whoever organized it had made peace with the fact that it wouldn't end the way they told everyone it would. In the end, there was no evidence of foul play. No physical clue to validate her story, but her interview shifted the tone of the case. Up until then, every theory had focused on something external, an animal, a stranger, a freak event. Alicia's story was the first time the search had turned inward toward the group itself, and for the first time, investigators began asking not just how 7 people vanished, but why someone might have chosen not to go. By 2010, the official case file had been moved to cold storage. The search reports, witness statements, drone maps, and toxicology archives were all digitized and boxed. No further leads had emerged. No new evidence had surfaced. The families, one by one, stopped calling, except for one. George Patel, father of Aaron, had not given up. Not during the first month, not during the first year, and certainly not after the state declared all 7 victims presumed dead. Every summer since the disappearance, he returned to the Sierra, sometimes alone, sometimes with volunteers, and always with his own hand-marked maps. George had never accepted the theory that the group had simply gotten lost. He believed something had scared them, driven them off their marked trail in a panic, something immediate, something they didn't plan for. And he believed the forest still held answers if someone was willing to look beyond the boundaries drawn in 2003. He was methodical. He used topographic overlays, tracked wildfire regrowth patterns, and noted any structural changes caused by landslides, animal migration, or erosion. He carried a handheld GPS and left behind recorded trails, complete with voice notes. If he saw disturbed brush, he logged it. If a cave entrance looked newly sealed or unstable, he flagged it with red tape and recorded the coordinates. Rangers began recognizing his truck at the Pine Meadow lot. He came so often, they left a spare form in the glove box for him to sign himself in. By 2007, George was bringing in outside help, volunteers from cadaver dog groups across California. He paid out of pocket for travel costs, equipment, and safety gear. One retired trainer from the Oakland K-9 unit came with a German shepherd named Bessie. They swept 15 miles in 3 days. Nothing. George hired a private drone team in 2008 to scan infrared anomalies near Deer Hollow, hoping heat signatures in shaded ravines might suggest remains. Again, nothing. But George wasn't discouraged. He began reading up on forensic geology, learning how minor depressions in soil could indicate old graves, how root growth patterns could shift subtly around decomposing tissue. In 2009, he convinced a semi-retired geologist from UC Davis to walk 2 full quadrants near the ridge. They took samples, analyzed chemical composition. Every test came back clean. What George found instead were questions. Dozens of small inconsistencies in the original reports. Why had one boot been found in a ravine 300 yards from the campsite with no matching prints leading to it? Why did the drone scans in 2003 skip over a half-collapsed gulch near the basin's southern face due to impassable canopy, but never return to it in fall when the leaves were gone? Why were no caves ever officially explored when the ridge was known to contain dozens, most of which had never been mapped? George began building his own overlays, clear acetate sheets layered over government maps, each marked with his own sightings, patterns, suspicions. He used red ink for natural anomalies, black for man-made ones. By the time local authorities reviewed his maps in 2010, they spanned 6 binders and over 80 square miles. The sheriff's office scanned them into the official case archive. Quietly, respectfully. They never said it aloud, but the tone had changed. Not because he'd found something, but because George had refused to stop asking. Some of the other parents had started calling him obsessive, not unkindly, just tired of reopening grief. But George believed something the rest didn't. He didn't think the forest had swallowed them. He thought the forest had hidden them. Not permanently, just enough to make it seem like they'd never been there at all. Every summer, he'd pack his bag, load his truck, and return to the same entry point. Always signed in, always walked out, and every year he told the ranger the same thing. "I'm not looking for all 7, just start with 1. In time, people forgot the names. The case became shorthand for a mystery without answers, but George never lost the thread. He said the forest remembers, not in words, but in patterns, in silence, in places that feel colder than they should. He once stood at the edge of a ravine and said it out loud. This place knows what happened. And the only reason no one had found them yet was because the wrong people had been asking the wrong questions. So he kept walking. Every year. Same pack, same notebooks, same hope. And in 2023, when the ice began to melt and someone else stumbled across something buried beneath the snow. It was George's map they used to get there. Because while the case had gone cold, George never had. The call came into the Fresno County Sheriff's Office just before noon on May 17, 2023. A hiker named Joel Friedman, who'd been photographing late spring runoff near the southern ridge of the Sierra Basin, reported something strange. What looked like a pale object frozen beneath a melting ledge of ice and packed snow, lodged near the base of a rock shelf. At first, he thought it was driftwood. Then he saw the sock. A faded white athletic sock stretched tightly around what could only be described as a human ankle, skin shriveled, frozen, bone visible at the heel. Joel took photos, sent coordinates. Authorities were dispatched within the hour. The site was just over 12 miles from the original Deer Hollow campsite, an elevation drop of nearly 2,000 feet, down a rugged gulch most hikers avoided due to frequent rock slides and no established trail. Recovery teams arrived that evening and waited until morning for full light. What they found shocked even the most seasoned among them. Just below the thawing boulder shelf, nestled between patches of frost-hardened soil and old debris, were 5 sets of remains. 2 were partially buried in loose sediment, covered in pine needles and half-frozen mud. The other 3 lay tangled in brush, arms wrapped around torsos, as if trying to conserve heat. The positions were not consistent with burial. They were consistent with collapse. Dental records and DNA confirmed what many had feared for 20 years. The remains belonged to 5 of the 7 missing campers: Sarah, Miles, Jess, Lucas, and Ian. All had been confirmed present at the original campsite. All had vanished in August 2003 without a trace. But now there were bones. And for the first time in 2 decades, there were answers, at least partial ones. Forensics moved quickly. Due to the preservation from cold, 3 of the skulls were intact enough to assess trauma. 2 showed signs of blunt force injury, fractures to the temporal bone and facial structure, most likely caused by impact with a hard object. The breaks were not uniform. One fracture had spatter marks typical of a fall or thrown object. The other had a cleaner impact point, suggesting a weapon. A third body, identified as Jess, had a shattered spine, with compression damage consistent with a vertical fall onto rock. The remaining 2, Sarah and Lucas, had no clear trauma, but tissue analysis from what remained of their clothing and marrow suggested hypothermia. They likely froze, unable to move, somewhere nearby. The diversity of injuries was troubling. Investigators had long theorized that if the group had succumbed to a single event, an animal attack, a storm, a river accident, the injuries would have looked the same. But this looked scattered, as if they hadn't all died together, as if something had separated them, chased them, or maybe turned them against each other. Forensics couldn't say, but the spacing of the remains, the different positions, the angle of the collapses, they all hinted at a larger scene, one filled with panic, disorientation, and desperation. George Patel was notified first. He'd always believed they had gone further than the original grid. The discovery was only a quarter mile from a point he'd marked in red on one of his overlays, an unscanned ravine he'd labeled collapsed brush zone, unstable. He arrived at the recovery site 2 days later and stood silently behind the tape line while technicians extracted the last remains. He didn't speak, just nodded once. He'd known. He'd always known. Authorities held a press conference the following week. The identities of the 5 recovered victims were released. The other 2, Becky and Aaron, remained missing. Officials admitted the cause of death for each recovered individual was still under analysis, but confirmed the case had now shifted from missing to homicide, multiple cause, fatality. They stopped short of saying foul play, but they no longer believed this was a natural disappearance. There were too many variables, too many injuries that didn't match. Back at the state lab, fibers from clothing, hair samples, and partial blood analysis were cataloged. A few recovered items included a rusted penknife, an empty canteen, and a melted Ziploc bag containing what looked like trail mix. One shoe had a partially preserved sock inside, damp with blood. It was Becky's size, but Becky hadn't been found. Investigators returned to the ravine and began expanding the search radius. They brought in climbing teams to assess vertical drop zones and new cadaver dogs trained in post-thaw recovery. Every step revealed new terrain they'd never searched in 2003, trails no one had walked in 20 years. For the families, the discovery was shattering, but also grounding. There was something final in bones, something undeniable. The kids had made it far. Much farther than anyone believed. But not all of them died the same way. And that fact alone meant the story wasn't finished. Something had happened out there. Something more than snow and cold. Something that fractured a group of friends into separate deaths, in separate positions, with separate wounds. And now, the forest was finally beginning to give that story back. One body at a time. The camcorder was found buried beneath a shallow drift of ice not far from where Jess's body had been recovered. Its casing was split down the side, the plastic warped from years of freeze-thaw cycles, but the mini DV tape inside was intact, just barely. It was logged as evidence, packaged with thermal gel packs and rushed to the forensics lab in Sacramento. No one expected it to work. But after several careful cleanings and a slow, low-temperature restoration process, the contents were extracted frame by frame. When the file finally loaded, the entire room went silent. There were 47 minutes of usable footage, and what it revealed would alter the investigation forever. The video began like any other student hiking trip. Shaky footage of boots crunching through leaves, laughter off camera, jokes about getting lost. Sarah held the camera first, narrating sarcastically while Lucas teased Miles about overpacking. There were sweeping shots of the lake, Aaron pretending to fish with a stick, Becky singing a few lines of some pop song. In those first minutes, they looked like any other group of friends, tired, happy, sunburned, full of inside jokes and careless optimism. But 15 minutes in, the mood began to shift. The camera changed hands several times, and at some point, Ian began filming. His tone was different. He wasn't joking. The video shows him walking behind the group, breathing heavy, saying things like, "I saw someone again," up past the switchback. The others laughed him off at first. Lucas told him to relax. But Ian kept zooming in toward the ridgeline, pointing at what he claimed were flashes of movement. The footage was too grainy to confirm, just blurry trees, nothing definitive. But Ian seemed convinced. At one point he stops walking altogether, whispering off camera, "He's back. Same guy, same coat." When asked who he meant, he didn't answer. The next segment picks up at dusk. The fire is burning low. The camera sits propped on a log, catching bits of conversation. Ian is no longer in frame, but his voice is raised. He's arguing with Lucas, accusing him of not saying anything back at school, of letting it go too far. The others try to de-escalate. Jess says something about everyone needing to calm down, but Ian won't let it drop. He says again that they're being watched, that someone's waiting for us to split up. The argument fades out as the camera tilts skyward and then cuts to black. The final 10 minutes are chaotic. Night has fallen, the footage jumps, handheld now, moving fast. Someone is running. Trees blur past in streaks. The audio picks up heavy breathing, snapping twigs, someone crying. A voice, likely Becky, screams, "Where is he? Where did he go?" Then silence. Then the beam of a flashlight whips through branches. A partial view of someone stumbling, possibly Sarah, barefoot, carrying one boot. More shouting, unclear. Then Ian again. "Don't go that way, he's right there." A branch cracks, loud, something falls. Then the feed cuts to black for a long stretch. In the final seconds, there's a brief return, just 6 seconds of video, barely visible. The camera lies tilted in the dirt. A single beam of light flickers in the distance. No voices, no motion. Then one sound, so soft it took hours of audio filtering to isolate. A breath, just one. And then, nothing. Investigators reviewed the footage dozens of times. They enhanced what they could. But there was no clear image of a second person, no confirmation that Ian's fears were rooted in anything but stress or paranoia. But what the video did prove, without question, was that something had gone horribly wrong. The group was afraid, not confused, not simply lost. Afraid. They weren't looking for a path out. They were running from something. Whether real or imagined, that fear drove them apart. Psychological experts were consulted. Some suggested mass panic, a form of shared psychosis triggered by isolation, altitude, or group tension. Others believed Ian might have experienced a break from reality, and the group's trust or distrust in his perception might have fueled an unraveling. But even then, it didn't explain the trauma on the bodies, or the sequence of deaths, or the direction they fled. The camera didn't solve the case. It didn't tell investigators who or what had caused that fear, but it changed the question. No longer. Why did they disappear? Now. What terrified them enough to run blind into the dark? And if Ian was right, if someone really had been up on that ridge, then the truth was still out there, somewhere between trees, watching and waiting to be found. Among the artifacts pulled from the ravine site, a small detail caught the attention of forensic analysts cataloging the footwear. 7 sets of shoes, each pair carefully photographed, bagged, and logged. 5 were linked to the confirmed remains. A sixth matched the partial shoe print found near the 2003 campsite, but the seventh pair stood out. It was in better condition than the others. Less weathered, soles only moderately cracked, the fabric surprisingly intact for something exposed to 2 decades of freeze-thaw cycles. It wasn't just age that set it apart, it was the make. A model of hiking boot not released until late summer 2003, just weeks before the trip. That narrowed the timeline, but what mattered more was what was found inside. During routine swabbing, a small patch of organic residue was detected beneath the inner tongue of the left boot, enough for a partial DNA profile. At first, analysts assumed it would match one of the 2 unrecovered campers, Becky or Aaron. But it didn't. It wasn't even close. It belonged to a male, older, unrelated to any of the 7, and it wasn't in the National Missing Persons Registry. For a moment, the case stalled again, until someone decided to run the sample through a broader state criminal database. A hit came back. Not from a major crime, but from an arrest record buried in the archives, a John Doe detained in 2011 for trespassing and suspected vagrancy at Kings Canyon National Park. No ID, no priors. He was held overnight, fingerprinted, and released the next day. Charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, and the man had disappeared into the system, until now. Fingerprints taken during that 2011 arrest were reanalyzed and matched to a partial print from the 2003 Pine Meadow Ranger Station logbook, the same page that had contained the signature Tanner M. Investigators now had confirmation. The man who signed into the forest 3 days after the group had gone missing wasn't just a hiker passing through. He had been there. His DNA was on one of the boots found at the death site, and he'd lied about his name. The task force reopened the case with this new lead, officially labeling the unknown man as a possible 8th person of interest. They pulled arrest photos from 2011, circulated facial composites, and checked homelessness shelters, regional hospitals, and mental health records across the state. Still, no confirmed name, no next of kin, no permanent address. He'd vanished again. But now, the framework of the story had shifted. For years, the mystery was how 7 young adults had vanished, but the evidence now pointed to 8 people entering that forest. One of them had come back. Speculation swirled. Some believed the man was an outsider who stumbled across the group and earned their trust. Others believed he knew one of them already, possibly from college or an overlapping past, and had joined intentionally, uninvited. And there were darker theories, that he'd followed them, that he was never meant to be part of the trip, but inserted himself somewhere along the trail. Forensic analysts examined the boot again and found another disturbing detail. The laces had been changed, not the factory default. These were heavy-duty leather straps tied in a double knot, standard military style. None of the missing had known military connections, but the 2011 arrest log had noted the man's backpack contained a dull multi-tool, a camp stove made from scrap metal, and a thermal blanket repurposed into a cloak. He lived like someone who had spent years outdoors, surviving. The discovery cast new light on Ian's paranoia in the camcorder footage. Maybe it wasn't a delusion. Maybe someone had been watching them from the ridge, not an animal, not a hallucination, a man, quiet, skilled, used to the terrain, someone who saw the group as a threat or as cover. The camera never showed his face, but the boot did, and the DNA didn't lie. The sheriff's office released a public appeal asking for help identifying the man arrested in 2011. They shared the sketch, the mugshot, and what little detail was known. The media dubbed him the survivor, but no one knew what he'd survived or what he'd caused, because someone had walked with the group, had worn their clothes, had watched them fall apart, and then walked away without a word, without ever being seen again. The break came not through fresh evidence, but through persistence. With the DNA match confirmed, fingerprints recovered from the 2003 Ranger Station logbook, and the false Tanner M. identity officially debunked, federal agents launched a focused search for the man whose boot print had been found alongside the bodies. They combed decades of park incident reports and vagrancy arrests across California, Oregon, and Washington. After sifting through hundreds of low-level citations, one name rose again and again: Wesley Turner. No fixed address, no verified employment, just a string of campsite warnings and minor infractions dating back over a decade. But the photo attached to a 2011 arrest in Kings Canyon sealed it. It was him, the man from the logbook, the man from the boot. On a cold morning in August 2023, authorities located him in rural eastern Oregon, living alone in a rusted trailer at the edge of a tree line outside La Grande. He was using the Turner alias, working odd jobs for cash, living off-grid with solar panels, hunting tools, and a rain-fed water system. When they arrived, he didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He opened the door, sat on the floor, and said, "I figured you'd come eventually." His real name was Walter Trask. He'd been a student at the same university as the missing group, expelled in 2001 under sealed disciplinary proceedings. The expulsion came after a misconduct report filed by a freshman girl who left school before it reached tribunal. The university never pressed criminal charges, and the case vanished quietly, known only to a few. But internal notes, now unsealed, revealed the names of two students involved in the aftermath, Ian Caldwell and Lucas Rivera, both part of the seven, both dead. At first, Walter denied involvement. He claimed he was camping in the area by coincidence, that he'd seen the group once but never interacted. But when shown the camcorder footage and confronted with DNA from the boot, his demeanor shifted. The lie collapsed. The truth followed. He said he'd read about the trip on a campus message board still active in the alumni forums. He recognized the names, recognized Lucas, and remembered Ian. He still believed, deeply, that the accusation made against him was false, that they'd lied to protect someone else, that they had never told the truth. He said he only wanted to talk, to confront, to force someone to say the words out loud. He hiked into the woods 2 days after the group arrived, staying hidden, tracking them from the ridge. He watched from the brush, waited for them to split up near the fire pit that night. Then, finally, he stepped into view. They didn't recognize him at first, but when they did, chaos broke out. He said Ian grabbed a stick. Lucas told him to leave. Sarah screamed. Someone threw a flashlight. Walter claimed he didn't attack first, that it was panic, not intent. He said he shoved someone away, possibly Jess, who fell and didn't move again. The group scattered, running in different directions into the dark. He followed. Not to harm, he claimed, but to explain, to make them listen. But in the process, he watched as they fell, one by one, off ledges, into brush, into freezing cold they couldn't survive. Walter admitted he spent the next 24 hours circling the ravine. He found Lucas dead from head trauma, Aaron curled under a boulder, frozen, Sarah face down in a dry creek bed. He tried to move some of them, he said. Covered what he could with branches and soil, took food, a coat, a boot to replace his own. Then he walked away. For 20 years he lived in tents, abandoned sheds, sometimes drainage culverts. He used aliases, kept off the grid, told no one. When asked why he signed the Ranger logbook, why he left behind even a trace, he shrugged. "I thought I might not make it out either," he said. "I didn't want to disappear without a name." The confession was clear, detailed, corroborated by recovered evidence and injury patterns. 2 victims had died from trauma, 1 from a fall, 2 from exposure. He had not killed them all directly, but he had triggered the panic, the confrontation, the separation that led to death. He buried their truth under mud, branches, and silence. Walter Trask was charged with multiple counts of second-degree murder, manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and unlawful disposal of human remains. He pled guilty. There was no trial, no public statement, no apology. In sentencing, the judge called him a man who weaponized fear to mask his own guilt. He was given life without parole. For the families, it was the answer they never thought they'd get. George Patel said only this: it wasn't the mountain, it was a man, and they were kids trying to get away. Because in the end, the forest hadn't taken them. They ran, and someone chased them, until there was no one left. It was late September when the final discovery came. The forest had been mostly quiet since Walter Trask's conviction, handed down after a 6-week trial that pulled every surviving thread of the investigation into one tightly bound conclusion. Families had begun the long, uneven process of closure. But the mountain hadn't finished giving back its dead. A research team from Cal State was conducting a geological survey on permafrost shifts when they noticed a narrow fissure just under a lichen-covered rock face. The area was steep, half a mile from the ravine where the others had been found, and previously inaccessible due to seasonal runoff. It took hours to lower equipment in, but by dusk, there was no question. 2 human skeletons rested side by side, tightly wedged in the gap. Recovery was slow and dangerous. The bodies were mostly bone, partially preserved by decades of shadow and cold. Clothing remnants helped identify them: Aaron's torn backpack strap, Becky's distinctive beaded bracelet. Dental records confirmed it. The last 2, the final names. The circle was closed. But something else had survived too. Tucked beneath a slab of stone near Becky's hip was a plastic sandwich bag, warped and melted from sun and time. Inside, miraculously intact, was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded into quarters. Faded ink bled through the creases. When opened, it revealed no date, no salutation, just 6 sentences written in a careful, shaky hand. "I never said anything. I should have. You were right to be scared. I was scared too. I wanted it to go away, but it never did. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I need you to know. It happened. And I'm sorry I let him stay." The letter had no name, no signature, but investigators didn't need one. It confirmed what Alicia had whispered nearly 2 decades earlier, that there was something unspoken between at least 2 members of the group, something buried long before their bodies were, something dark, something that allowed Walter Trask to believe he had justification for what he did, and something that allowed silence to grow until it collapsed under its own weight. The letter was tested, preserved, and declared authentic. Experts dated the ink to early 2003, just months before the trip. Analysts believe it had been written by one of the women, possibly Jess or Sarah, and kept hidden in a pack or shared quietly during the first night in the woods. Its tone suggested guilt, not threat. But guilt can unravel a group just as fast as fear. When the families were notified, some asked to see it, others declined. George Patel read it once and handed it back, saying only, "They knew something was broken." For the public, the release of the letter added a final piece to the puzzle, not one that explained everything, but one that confirmed the fracture. That the group was not just running from a man in the woods, they were running from something already inside them, a betrayal, a truth, a rot that Walter had only magnified. That October, the county held a joint memorial for all 7 victims. The families gathered at a newly cleared lookout above Ridgewater Spur, the trail where it had all begun. A ranger read the names aloud. A plaque was unveiled: Lucas, Sarah, Ian, Becky, Miles, Jess, Aaron. Below it, an inscription: "They didn't vanish. They tried to come home." The camcorder and the recovered letter were donated to the Sierra Heritage Museum, placed in a climate-controlled case beside the original trail logbook from 2003. The signature Tanner M. remains visible in faded ink, forever linked to the man who turned their final weekend into a graveyard. In the months that followed, the trail was formally renamed. What had once been labeled 9C in the ranger system was now known as the 7 Pines Trail. Markers were updated, new maps printed, but the name came not from bureaucrats, but from something George Patel had done quietly each year before the truth was known. At every site where he thought a body might be, he planted a pine seedling, 7 in total, not to mark graves, but to give the forest something to remember them by. The rangers kept them alive, even during drought, and now they stood, small but growing, along the trail where the group had last walked. Walter Trask will spend the rest of his life in prison. No parole, no appeal. He did not speak at his sentencing. He did not apologize. Psychologists describe him as narcissistic, emotionally arrested, obsessed with a perceived injustice that never belonged to him. In the end, he wasn't a monster. He was a man who refused to take responsibility, who chose to weaponize someone else's silence and made sure no one else could speak again. But the mountain had held its breath long enough. Snow melted, roots shifted, ice cracked, and piece by piece the truth returned. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to know they didn't simply vanish. They ran. Some tried to help each other. Some tried to hide. Some forgave. Some didn't. But none of them made it out, because someone chased them, not for money, not for thrill, but for closure twisted into vengeance. And in the end, the only witness left was the snow. It kept their secrets, preserved their fear, froze a moment in time that, for 20 years, no one understood. Until now.